train. You are about to embark on a trip around Visby. Welcome aboard the Visby train. You are about to embark on a trip around Visby town walls. Try to imagine that we are about to travel through time, from way back in the Stone Age right up to today. Our trip begins here in Visby Harbour. Hundreds and thousands of tourists come here each year to visit Visby and Gotland. Let's begin with a question. How did it all begin? Well, there is a Stone Age site with remains of people who lived there as long as 6,000 years ago. It is 2 meters underground, up in what today is known as the main square in Visby. This was their seasonal home, where they stayed when they hunted seal and fish. In those days, the shore was much higher up than today. If you visit the main square later, try to picture a seashore with small huts and the fishermen's and seal hunters' dugout canoes hauled up on the beach. There was an old malt factory here beside the harbour in the 19th century. Today, it is a modern meeting place where people from all over the world can gather and gain inspiration from others. The building is now the University of Uppsala, campus Gotland. It adjoins the town library, which offers a beautiful view of Elmdale Park. Elmdale Park was a sea bay in the Viking Age. People at the farms nearby converted it into a harbour over 1,000 years ago. Just imagine if we could travel back to that time and wander along the street Strandgatan. Today it is stone paved. Then we would have been on a sandy beach with the swell of the waves around our feet. Later, in the 13th century, 800 years ago, a medieval stone town was built. Still to this day, some of the medieval cordy stepped buildings stand tall in Strandgatan, here behind the walls. The town's oldest watchtower is still standing at the far end of the headland, which was once part of the medieval harbour. It was built in the mid-12th century, so it is almost 900 years old. It was given its present name, the Gunpowder Tower, in the 18th century when the army began to store its gunpowder there. It was known as the Lamb Tower in the medieval period, since the lamb was the symbol of the Gotlanders. Coins and flags also bore the lamb symbol. From the very top of the tower, guards could patrol the battlement and defend the town with their bows or crossbows if ever enemies ventured to enter the harbour. The Gunpowder Tower was also used as a prison over 300 years ago. It wasn't really a prison, but a bare and miserable dungeon for those who refused to confess to a crime. Just imagine sitting there in the dark on a hard stone floor without a bed or toilet, with the cold autumn winds blowing in. That would be enough to make anyone confess to a crime, whether they were guilty or not. Thank goodness it is no longer a prison, and how lucky we are that such an old tower, where centuries once patrolled and stood guard, has survived to this day. The seafront and promenade run alongside the seawall with a spectacular view across the sea. Whatever town walls is the former fishermen's district. If you had taken this train trip 100 years ago, you would have noticed the smell of fish entrails. This district is actually named Fish Entrails District. The entrails were from the Baltic herring. The district has a number of delightful lanes where you can enjoy the scent of the luminous roses and see all the preserved small timber houses from the 18th and 19th centuries. The Pippi Longstocking films were shot on location continued a happy life. Don't miss visiting the botanical gardens behind the walls. They were opened in 1855 and are known for their numerous exotic plants and trees and for their beautiful rose beds. The town walls girdling Visby are about 3.5 kilometers in circumference. Why don't you try testing how fast you can run all the way around the walls later? Or why not cycle round? Or alternatively, just take a leisurely stroll and study the towers. They started building the walls almost 800 years ago. It's unbelievable. Town walls were common in those days, not only to mark a border and form a defence, but also to force visitors to pay a toll for the right to trade in the town. The people of Visby had wanted to put a stop to the farmers trading with other countries for quite some time. Many tradesmen in Visby were eager to get a monopoly on the lucrative trading. When the farmers found themselves cut off, a civil war between Visby and the farmers in the countryside broke out in 1288. Visby won the war and monopolised trade. They raised the height of the walls from about 6 to 10 metres and added a large number of defence towers to the landward walls. The section of the walls is therefore much higher than the seawall. The seawall has a number of smaller towers. One of them is the subject of a famous legend. It was said that Neil Goodsmed's daughter divulged the town's defence strategies to the Danish king Valdemar Atterdag. Her treachery enabled Valdemar to conquer Visby in 1361. Her punishment was to be incarcerated in the tower, which is now called the Maiden Tower. Imagine what it must feel like being locked up in a tower with no door. But if this legend was true, the treacherous maiden would have had to wait an awful long time for her terrible punishment. The Maiden Tower wasn't built until 50 years after the Danish invasion. The name actually derives from an ancient liquid measure called a maiden in Swedish. It is roughly the same as a snit, about 8.2 centilitres or 3 fluid ounces. After the botanical gardens, we arrive at a large grassy area known as Pavillons Plan. A medieval market is set up here during the annual medieval week in August. We have just passed a corner tower called Silverhood Tower. The name dates back to the medieval period, and we think that the roof was of shining material, perhaps some kind of metal, which has given the tower its name. Here on our right, you can visit tournaments in the medieval week. Jesters, fire eaters, and competing knights will entertain you. As you turn the corner and start to leave the sea, you will see Visby Hospital on your left, a large modern hospital for Gotland's 61,000 inhabitants. The north face of the walls on our right has tumbled down on several occasions. This is because the ground here is clayey and marshy. The 40-metre-long collapsed wall nearest the sea is called the Lubeck Breach. The town was said to have suffered an attack here in 1525. It was a misty May morning, and the German town Lubeck had secretly sent over a large fleet. They came to Visby to oust a notorious pirate who was disturbing traffic in the Baltic Sea. The pirate was called Soren Norby, and he left Gotland after the attack on Visby. The town was gutted by cannons and fire. Some of Visby's churches were destroyed in these attacks and left to fall into ruins. On your left, you will be able to see the ruins of St. George's Church. One of the gates leading from the town to this church is called St. George's Gate. St. George's Hospital was situated close to the church. All fighting with his sword, thus rescuing a princess that the dragon had captured. He later became a saint and was the patron saint of lepers. In the medieval period, leprosy was one of the most dreaded diseases. The victims lost parts of their bodies, such as their noses, which rotted. The disease was thought to be highly contagious, but now we know that it wasn't. The afflicted were not allowed to live in Visby, but had to stay at St. George's Leprosarium so as not to spread the disease to other people. As we continue up the somewhat steep hill, we can see the North Gate on our right. The former main road from the countryside in the north ended here. The robust tower had an enormous defence capacity. The outer timber gates were reinforced with a portcullis. Perhaps you have seen something similar in books about knights or films, for example, Robin Hood. The floor above the gate vault once had a fireplace, which meant that knights could also keep watch for the tower in wintertime. Higher up, you can see large square openings in the walls. They are former arrow loops which were widened in 1710 to accommodate flights. It's hard to understand how people could have believed that the walls would provide sufficient defence against an enemy as late as in the 18th century. As we turn right, you will be able to see the wall's most impressive and best preserved section. It is situated on a high level and robustly built on a limestone cliff. We can just imagine how the sentries, with bows and arrows or crossbows, once kept watch through the loopholes along the central walls. The tall tower is a section of timber and a tower is known as Dalman's Gate. It is named after a county governor called Dalman. He had the tower converted into a granary during the years of famine in the 18th century. What might the tower have been called in the medieval period? Perhaps Mejerigatan or Our Lady's Gate. The tower might have had some connections with St. Mary's Church, also known as Our Lady's Church. You can see the church steeples rising above the town walls. It's hard to believe that priests in the medieval period could also earn money by trading. The church even stored commodities up in the attic. The goods may have been driven through Dalman's Gate onto the cliff edge, which was on the same level as the church loading bay. Products could be transported in small carts across a wooden bridge which connected the cliff-top Klinteberget with the church attic. This would have been very precarious since they were high above the ground and a fall would have been fatal. We now pass one of the best preserved sections of the town walls. Every other defence tower is ground-based, while those in between are called saddle towers, as they are straddled over the crown of the wall like a horse saddle. These top-heavy saddle towers put an enormous strain on the wall construction and caused parts of the walls to tumble down. That we are in the 14th century. Then we would be travelling through a flat landscape with no trees or bushes. The walls stood heavy and forbidding, surrounded by moats, which were actually deep stone quarries. When we see people walking along the ramparts or in the moats today, they walk on soft hillocks. But in the medieval period, the completely dry moats looked like ruptures in the landscape. The people then came face to face with a menacing and barren expanse. Perhaps you remember how the farmers were no longer allowed to trade after Visby built the town walls, and how they lost the civil war and were barred from the fierce trade competition. These were the very reasons why the landscape was cleared of bushes and trees. The guards on the walls needed to spot any approaching enemies at a great distance. The limestone was quarried on site. This gave the masons ready material for the walls, and at the same time the quarries made approach difficult for the enemy. The East End, a typical Swedish shopping centre that can be found anywhere in Sweden. Today, Visby is a town with about 25,000 inhabitants, although only about 3,000 live in intramural Visby. To the right is the East Gate. Above the former gate, there used to be a 5-storey tower. On the floor above the gate vault, there was a hearth, stove, and a medieval toilet. This must mean that guards occupied the tower all year round. The guards could boil oil or other nasty things on the hearth and pour it on any invading enemies. Let us travel back in time to witness what happened in the bloody and horrendous year of 1361. The land outside the town walls is barren wasteland. About 2,000 farmers from the north of Gotland have gathered alongside the outer wall face. They stand in long rows between the East Gate and the South Gate. It is Tuesday, the 27th of July, and the peasant army has gathered at dawn to meet the Danish invading army, led by King Valdemar Atterdag. The king has come to conquer Gotland and gain mastery over the merchant town. Look to your left and you will see the stadium Gotland. This is roughly where Valdemar took up his position, giving him a good overview of the battlefield. Football team, FC Gotha. Right, no more about football, let's get back to the Danish invasion. The atmosphere is tense. Farmers have marched to Visby to join forces with the town's guards and defend the island from the sentry walk up on the wall. But at the last minute, Visby withdraws from their joint strategy and decides not to wage war against King Valdemar. The dreadful thing is that the farmers probably haven't been informed. Visby has betrayed the farmers who had to fight with a 10-metre wall behind them with no means of retreat. The battle began with both sides pelting each other with arrows. Then the Danes advanced. The ensuing battle was extremely violent and devastating for the untrained Gotlandic farmers. Before sunset, 1,800 farmers lay slain outside the walls. The farmers were buried along with a couple of hundred Danish soldiers at the nuns' convent Mont Soleil. Still to this day there is a memorial cross at the site of the mass graves. It was raised about 10 years after the battle by the wives and children of the slain. The inscription reads, "Goods were put to the sword by Danes in front of Visby's gates. Pray for their souls." Still today, people place flowers in front of the memorial cross. If you want to know more about the Danish invasion in 1361, we recommend a visit to Gotland Museum in Visby. There you will find many interesting stories, as well as armour, weapons and skeletons from the Gotlandic mass graves. As we pass through the south gate, look up to your left inside the tower. You might catch sight of the only decoration on the walls. It is a slightly worn stone sculpture of a double face. Today, it is difficult to discern the face special features. Who could it be? The South Square was a military training area in the 18th century. Later, in the 1860s, it became a market square, and Mejerigatan, which runs through Visby to the south gate, became, and still is, the town's famous shopping street. We continue our trip through what was once the bailey of the enormous and impregnable Visby Castle. It was built adjoining the south wall in the 15th century. Do you remember Soren Nordby, the pirate who boarded and looted so many ships here in the Baltic Sea? And how the Germans came here to oust him with fire and cannons? He was one of Danish county guns who ruled over Visby Castle. No merchant ship was safe here under his rule in the 16th century. The last time the castle was besieged was in the 1670s. When they were finally forced to leave the island, they blew the castle to pieces. Imagine the explosion. All that remains today are a few remnants of ruins beside the south town. For a prisoner who served time there. Instead of having to tell everyone that he had been away for several years because he had served time in prison, he could say that he had signed on for service aboard the seven-masted schooner. One of Sweden's largest bike rental businesses is to the right of the roundabout in the harbour area. It is known as Gotland Cyclist and has more than 800 bikes. Archer? drawing to a close, and we thank you for joining us. Someone who has literally travelled the whole earth by this train is the legendary driver Bera. He has driven the train so many times for so many years that he has driven the entire circumference of the earth twice over. Enjoy the rest of your day.